Every time I think I couldn't possibly love him more, I find out I'm wrong. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would one day sit in my kitchen crying over the way my husband quietly washed dishes after I had a terrible day, I would have laughed in their face. Not because washing dishes is some grand romantic gesture, but because I used to think love was supposed to be loud. I believed love had to be expensive vacations, dramatic declarations, surprise gifts, flowers every Friday, and those perfect social media moments where couples looked like they belonged in movies. That's what I grew up seeing online. That's what I thought I deserved. I had no idea that real love usually arrives wearing old sweatpants, carrying grocery bags with sore hands, asking if you've eaten today and remembering the smallest details about you that even you've forgotten. Every single time I tell myself, there's no way I could possibly love this man any more than I already do, life somehow proves me wrong. Somehow he finds another quiet way to remind me why I married him, and every time it catches me completely off guard. We met in the least romantic way imaginable. I had just started working at a small accounting office, and he was the IT guy who only came around whenever someone's computer stopped cooperating. The first thing I noticed wasn't his looks or his smile, it was how unbelievably patient he was. One of my older co-workers accidentally deleted an entire spreadsheet she'd spent hours working on. She was practically in tears, convinced she'd lose her job. Most people would have sighed, complained, or acted annoyed because she'd made such a simple mistake. Instead, he smiled gently and said, "Let's see what we can do before we panic." 45 minutes later, he'd recovered almost everything. She hugged him while crying and he looked embarrassed, saying anyone would have done the same. The truth was, most people wouldn't have, they would have made her feel stupid. That was the first time I noticed there was something different about him. We became friends without either of us trying very hard. We'd eat lunch together whenever he happened to be in the building, complain about traffic, exchange terrible jokes, and slowly learn each other's stories. He wasn't flashy or overly confident. He didn't flirt endlessly or play games. If he said he'd call, he called. If he promised he'd help, he showed up. If he couldn't make it, he'd tell me beforehand instead of making excuses afterward. It sounds incredibly basic, but after years of dating people who treated consistency like it was optional, his reliability felt almost unbelievable. I kept waiting for the mask to slip. I kept expecting him to become selfish, dishonest, or emotionally unavailable like so many people I'd dated before. But month after month he stayed exactly the same. Calm, kind, honest. It almost scared me because I didn't know people like that actually existed. About a year into our relationship, I lost my dad unexpectedly. It was one of those phone calls that permanently divides your life into before and after. I remember dropping my phone onto the floor because my hand stopped working. I don't even remember calling my boyfriend. Somehow he knew. Less than an hour later, he was standing outside my apartment door carrying absolutely nothing. No flowers, no balloons, no meaningless inspirational quotes, just himself. He wrapped his arms around me while I completely fell apart. He didn't tell me everything would be okay because he knew it wouldn't. He didn't try to fix my grief because grief isn't something you fix. He simply stayed. For hours, then days, then weeks. He quietly handled grocery shopping, cleaned my apartment while I slept, answered phone calls I couldn't emotionally deal with, and made sure I remembered to drink water. Looking back, I honestly don't know how I survived those months without him. He became my strength when I had absolutely none left. That was the first time I remember thinking, this has to be the maximum amount of love a person can feel. Surely nothing could make me love him more than I already did after watching him carry me through the darkest chapter of my life. But I was wrong, completely wrong, because love doesn't seem to have a ceiling. Every season of life simply reveals another side of someone you never knew existed. Every challenge uncovers another reason to admire them. Every difficult moment becomes another opportunity for them to show you exactly who they are. I didn't realize it then, but that was only the beginning of discovering the kind of man I had chosen to spend my life with. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony that cost less than what some people spend on decorations alone. We couldn't afford anything extravagant, and honestly neither of us cared. My dress wasn't designer, his suit wasn't custom made. Our reception was held in a community hall decorated by family members the night before. Half the flowers were arranged by my aunt, and my cousin nearly dropped the wedding cake while carrying it inside. It was chaotic, imperfect, and somehow absolutely perfect. During his vows, he looked directly into my eyes and promised something that sounded almost too simple. He said, "I can't promise life will always be easy. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, but I promise you'll never have to face those mistakes alone." At the time, everyone smiled politely because it sounded sweet. I don't think anyone realized those words would become the foundation of our entire marriage. Marriage wasn't magical every single day. We argued about laundry, finances, whose turn it was to cook dinner, and whether the thermostat was too cold or too warm. We had stressful months when money barely stretched far enough. We experienced disappointments, unexpected bills, family drama, and nights where exhaustion made both of us irritable, but even during our worst arguments, something always stood out. He never tried to win. He wanted to solve the problem instead of defeating me. Even when he was frustrated, he refused to insult me or throw old mistakes back in my face. If he realized he'd hurt my feelings, he'd apologize sincerely instead of defending himself endlessly. Watching someone choose humility over pride is strangely attractive. Every single time he admitted he was wrong without being forced to, I somehow loved him even more. Then something happened that made me question whether I'd ever truly understood what unconditional love looked like. About 3 years into our marriage, I was laid off without warning. The company had been struggling for months, but management kept assuring everyone that our jobs were safe. Then one Friday afternoon we were all called into a meeting, handed envelopes, thanked for our hard work, and sent home with our final paychecks. I remember sitting in my car gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers turned white. My mind immediately went to the mortgage, the electricity bill, groceries, and every other responsibility waiting for us at home. I wasn't just worried about money, I felt like I'd failed us. I kept rehearsing how I was going to tell my husband, convinced he'd be disappointed even if he didn't say it out loud. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd already cried most of my makeup off and could barely bring myself to walk through the front door. The second he saw my face, he knew something was wrong. Before I could even get the words out, he wrapped me in a hug so tight that I completely lost whatever composure I had left. Between sobs, I finally managed to whisper, "I lost my job." I expected questions, I expected panic, maybe even frustration. Instead, he gently rubbed my back and quietly said, "Okay, then we'll figure it out together." Just like that, no blame, no lectures, no disappointed sigh. He didn't ask how it happened or what I could have done differently. His first instinct wasn't to judge me, it was to stand beside me. Looking back now, those 7 words carried more comfort than any grand speech ever could. They reminded me that our marriage had never been about one person carrying all the weight. It was always about sharing it. The months that followed were some of the hardest we've ever faced. I spent hours every day applying for jobs, rewriting my resume, attending interviews, and hearing the same polite rejection over and over again. Every rejection chipped away at my confidence. I stopped believing in myself. I started apologizing constantly, for not contributing enough, for spending money on groceries, even for existing in a house where I felt like I wasn't pulling my weight. One evening I apologized again after he'd cooked dinner for the 3rd night in a row. He quietly put down his fork, looked me straight in the eyes and asked, "Would you expect me to apologize for needing you if our roles were reversed?" I immediately shook my head. "Exactly," he replied. "So stop expecting something from yourself that you'd never expect from me." I don't think he realized it, but those words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. Eventually I found another job and life slowly settled into a rhythm again. I thought that difficult chapter was behind us. I thought I'd already experienced the deepest reasons I could possibly have to love this man. Once again I underestimated him. About a year later his mother became seriously ill. She needed constant care, frequent hospital visits, and eventually assistance with almost everything. Watching him become her caregiver changed something inside me. She hadn't always been the easiest person to get along with. They'd had disagreements over the years, and there were painful moments in their relationship that would have given many people an excuse to keep their distance. But he never did. Every weekend he drove across town to help her. He cleaned her house, made her meals, organized her medication, and sat beside her for hours even when she couldn't do much more than sleep. Not because anyone expected him to, but because he believed love wasn't measured by convenience. One afternoon I accompanied him to one of her doctor's appointments. While she was inside with the nurse, I watched him quietly kneel beside her wheelchair in the waiting room to fix the loose footrest she'd been complaining about. He didn't realize anyone was watching. There were no cameras, no audience, no praise waiting for him afterward. He simply noticed something that needed to be done and did it without expecting recognition. For some reason, that tiny moment hit me harder than almost anything else. It reminded me that a person's true character isn't revealed by the big dramatic gestures everyone applauds. It's revealed by the countless little things they do when nobody's paying attention. Around the same time, I started noticing another pattern. He remembered everything about me. Not the obvious things. Everyone remembers birthdays and favorite colors. He remembered the strange little details I barely noticed myself. He knew I hated the sound of chewing when I had a headache. He remembered that I always lost my hair ties and started buying extra packs before I even realized they were running low. If we went grocery shopping, he'd quietly grab my favorite tea without asking because he'd noticed I only had 2 bags left. If we watched a movie together, he'd automatically hand me a blanket halfway through because he knew I'd get cold before I admitted it. None of those things were expensive or dramatic, but together they painted a picture of someone who paid attention, not because he had to, but because he genuinely cared. Then came the moment I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. We had been trying to have a baby for nearly 2 years without success. Every negative pregnancy test felt heavier than the last. I blamed myself constantly. I cried in secret so he wouldn't have to carry my sadness on top of his own disappointment. One evening I finally broke down and told him that maybe he'd chosen the wrong person to marry. Maybe he'd be happier with someone who could give him the family he'd always dreamed about. I expected him to reassure me with the usual clichés people say in moments like that. Instead, he looked almost offended, not at me but at the idea itself. He took both my hands in his and quietly said, "I didn't marry you because I wanted children. I married you because I wanted you. If we have children someday, they'll be a blessing. But if we never do, I still wake up every morning next to the person I chose. That was always the dream." I completely fell apart after hearing those words, not because they magically erased the pain we were carrying, but because they reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Love isn't built on conditions. It isn't dependent on careers, money, health, or whether life unfolds exactly the way you planned. It's choosing the same person again and again, even when life looks different than either of you imagined. As I cried into his shoulder that night, the familiar thought crossed my mind once more. There's absolutely no way I could ever love this man more than I do right now. And once again, I was wrong. Life has a funny way of testing the promises you make on your happiest days. Just when we thought we'd finally found our rhythm again, I was involved in a car accident on my way home from work. It wasn't life-threatening, but it left me with a broken leg, a fractured wrist, and months of physical therapy ahead of me. I remember lying in the hospital feeling completely helpless. I wasn't thinking about the pain as much as I was thinking about becoming a burden. I couldn't walk without assistance, couldn't cook, couldn't drive, and couldn't even button my own shirt with one hand. The independent woman I'd always been suddenly disappeared overnight, and I hated every second of it. I kept apologizing to my husband before he even had the chance to complain. But he never did. Not once. Instead, he smiled every time I said sorry and replied with the exact same words. "You do the same for me." Deep down, I knew he was right, but somehow hearing him say it made me feel less guilty and more loved. The next few months showed me a version of my husband I didn't even know existed. Every morning he woke up nearly an hour earlier than usual, so he could help me shower safely before getting himself ready for work. He learned how to braid my hair because I couldn't lift my arm high enough to do it myself. The first few attempts were terrible, crooked, uneven, and hilarious, but every morning he tried again until he finally got it right. Sometimes I'd catch him secretly watching tutorial videos late at night, practicing on one of my old mannequin heads that I'd kept from cosmetology school years earlier. He never told me he'd been practicing. I only found out because I walked into the spare room one evening and found him concentrating harder on a braid than I'd ever seen him concentrate on anything. When he noticed me standing there, he looked embarrassed and laughed, saying, "I wanted tomorrow's braid to look better." I laughed too, but the second I closed the door I cried. Not because of the braid itself, but because someone loved me enough to spend hours learning something that only mattered because it mattered to me. Recovery was slow, frustrating, and exhausting. Some days I'd make progress and other days I'd feel like I'd gone backwards. There were mornings when I wanted to give up completely because even standing for a few minutes felt impossible. Every time I reached that point, he somehow knew exactly what to say. He never pressured me. He never made me feel weak. He simply celebrated every tiny victory as though it were the greatest accomplishment in the world. The first day I managed to walk across the living room without my crutches, he actually stood up and applauded. It was ridiculous, completely over the top, and exactly what I needed. He made me feel proud of victories I would have dismissed as insignificant. He reminded me that healing isn't about giant leaps, it's about refusing to stop taking small steps. One evening after months of therapy, we decided to go for a short walk around the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We walked slowly, much slower than we used to, and every few steps he'd glance over to make sure I wasn't in pain. Halfway through the walk I stopped, looked at him, and asked a question that had been sitting in my heart for years. How do you always know what I need? He smiled, shrugged his shoulders, and answered so casually that I almost missed the depth of what he was saying. I don't always know, he admitted. I just keep paying attention until I figure it out. Those words stayed with me because they perfectly described our entire relationship. Love wasn't magic for him. It wasn't instinct. It was attention. It was choosing every single day to notice me. A few months later, while cleaning out an old drawer, I stumbled across a small notebook I'd never seen before. At first I thought it belonged to me, but when I opened it, I realized it was his handwriting. I almost closed it immediately because it felt private, but on the very first page he'd written, "If you ever find this one day, I hope it reminds you how much you've always been loved." My hands started shaking as I turned the pages. Inside wasn't a diary about himself, it was a collection of little notes about me, dates when I'd accomplished something I was proud of, lists of my favorite snacks in case I changed my mind while he was shopping. Little reminders like, she gets quiet when she's overwhelmed, don't assume she's angry. She smiles the biggest when she's genuinely surprised. Buy sunflowers instead of roses, they remind her of summer. On one page he had simply written, "Never let her forget how capable she is, especially on the days she forgets herself." I couldn't stop crying. For years I'd believed he was effortlessly thoughtful. I never realized he had been intentionally studying the person he loved because he wanted to become a better husband. That notebook completely changed the way I understood love. So many people spend years searching for someone who makes their heart race, someone exciting, someone who gives them butterflies. Those things are wonderful, but they don't carry a marriage through ordinary Tuesdays, unexpected tragedies, financial stress, illnesses, disappointments, and long seasons where life feels repetitive. What carries a marriage is someone who chooses you consistently. Someone who notices when you're struggling before you say a word. Someone who keeps showing up long after the honeymoon phase has faded. Someone who still looks at you with kindness even after seeing every flaw, every insecurity, and every mistake you've ever made. That's the kind of love I was lucky enough to find. A few nights ago we were sitting on our porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the sky. Neither of us was talking. We were simply enjoying the cool breeze and listening to the rain. Out of nowhere he reached over, squeezed my hand, and smiled the same quiet smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. There was no special occasion. No anniversary. No birthday, nothing worth celebrating except another ordinary evening together. As I looked at him, older than the man I'd first met but somehow even more handsome to me now, I realized something that made me laugh. I had spent years telling myself I'd reached the limit of how much I could love this man. And every single time, life had gently proven me wrong. Maybe that's what real love actually is. It isn't one giant moment. It isn't one unforgettable gesture. It's thousands of ordinary moments that quietly build a life together until one day you wake up, look across the room at the person you've loved for years, and realize your heart somehow found even more room than it had yesterday. So if you're lucky enough to have someone who makes your hard days easier, who stays when life gets messy, who loves you in ways the world never notices, don't wait until they're gone to tell them how much they matter. Say it today. Hug them a little longer. Thank them for the little things, because the little things eventually become the biggest parts of your story. And as for me, every time I think I couldn't possibly love him more, I find out I'm wrong.